The freedoms that are now being violated, the most obvious ones are financial freedoms. You wonder why people are investing in crypto? You wonder why people are trying to skip financial institutions? The reason for that is because of what Canada is attempting right now. Okay, what Canada is attempting right now is unprecedented. It's crazy. So it used to be in tyrannical countries that you didn't want to keep your money in the bank because the government could just take over the bank and then grab your money. Instead, you actually kept cash in your mattress. Tyrannical countries did not offer you the inviolable guarantee of the safety of your property. Well, that's what Canada is doing right now. Canada's Minister of Finance, a woman named Chrystia Freeland, ironically, she is now suggesting that without court order, without legal basis, financial services providers are going to freeze or suspend accounts, financial accounts. If you wonder again why people are a little bit nervous about the idea of a Fed coin in the United States or centralized banking via the Federal Reserve in the United States, this is the reason. Because if your money exists at the tolerance of the government can take away that money at any time. Okay, so here is the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, announcing that financial services providers will be able to freeze or suspend accounts without court orders if they back the protest movement.
The government is issuing an order with immediate effect under the Emergencies Act, authorizing Canadian financial institutions to temporarily cease providing financial services where the institution suspects that an account is being used to further the illegal blockades and occupations. As of today, a bank or other financial service provider will be able to immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order. In doing so, they will be protected against civil liability for actions taken in good faith.
Okay, this is insane. That's an insane provision. Just to explain what she is now saying, this would be the equivalent of Bank of America thinks that you are giving to, for example, the NRA. And the NRA has this group of people who might be associated with, might not be associated with it, who may engage in activities that the government doesn't like. And maybe the money ends up being traced all the way back to the bank and to your account in the bank. The bank can now prevent you from accessing that account. They can freeze your account or suspend it with no court order to do. They can just remove your property from you, and they are shielded from liability from you. So in other words, in order to shield them from quote unquote civil liability on the other end, the government would shield the bank from civil liability from you. They don't need a court order. They don't need to tell you even that they're freezing your account or suspending your account. They certainly don't need to go through a legal process. This is what Canada is doing. That's nuts. That is nuts. So if you keep your money in a Canadian bank right now, and you want to give your money to any part of the protest movement, not even members of the protest movement who are using their trucks to impede traffic or anything, you just want, this would be it really is the equivalent of, in the United States, companies spent some $21 billion on the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. $21 billion. Imagine if banks could have been held civilly liable for any act attached to the Black Lives Matter movement, and then banks were told that they could freeze any account money that they thought was going to be spent on any part of the Black Lives Matter movement that could have been fungibly moved over to criminal activity. You know what a violation of the First Amendment that is? You know what a violation of basic financial privacy that is? And basic financial freedom? This is why people are investing in crypto, because crypto goes person to person without any sort of intermediating entity. It doesn't require the government's approval. It doesn't require bank approval. When the governments can go to the banks to shut down your ability to actually transfer money because they tell the banks that those banks could be theoretically held civilly. You never know. You might be held civilly liable. If you give money to the Freedom Convoy, you might be held civilly liable, you bank. And so why don't you just shut down that account right there? And don't worry, if you do that with no court order, with no actual court order, with no due process, if you do that, I can't even sue you. If I've got money in the bank and I just want to give some money to the Freedom Convoy and you shut down my entire account to prevent that from happening, with no court order, I can no longer sue you under the Emergencies Act in Canada. That's totally insane. This is treating people as though they are funding terrorism. That's what it is. Now, the current terrorist laws in Canada do not cover things like funding the Freedom Convoy, because why should they? These are not terrorists. So what are they doing in Canada? They're expanding the terror financing rules to cover the Freedom Convoy. So now it's Al-Qaeda and the Freedom Convoy in Canada. This is truly frightening stuff. Here's Chrystia Freeland, again, the ironically named Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
We are broadening the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules so that they cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment service providers they use. These changes cover all forms of transactions, including digital assets, such as cryptocurrencies.
So now they're going after crowdfunding platforms. So if you try to transfer crypto via a crowdfunding platform, they're going to go after the crowdfunding platforms. Totally insane. I mean, again, you want to undermine trust in government, this is the way to do it. The left seems to think that the less people trust the government, the more the government should exert its authority in order to force the trust. That is not how that works. In any sort of human relationship, once trust begins to wane, attempts to reestablish trust through authoritarian force and tyranny are likely to produce precisely the opposite result. People are going to trust the government less because now they know what the government is willing to do. And again, they're only willing to do this because they hate the cause. That's all. They're only willing to do this because Justin Trudeau personally despises the people who are doing this. He's made that very clear. I mean, last week, Justin Trudeau ripped the truckers as racist without any real evidence.
We are not intimidated by those who hurl insults and abuse at small business workers and steal food from the homeless. We won't give in to those who fly racist flags. We won't cave to those who engage in vandalism or dishonor the memory of our veterans.
What a douchebag. I mean, seriously, this is how he characterized the entire Freedom Convoy movement, stealing food from the homeless. Flying Nazi flag. Show me widespread evidence that this is what's happening at the Freedom Convoy. Please. Widespread evidence. Again, with Black Lives Matter, you had some $2 billion in insured property damage done by people associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we were told that it was peaceful, but a little fiery. Mostly peaceful, but fiery. Here, you have like one guy who's been seen waving a swastika flag and was told immediately by people on the ground to stop that crap. And Justin Trudeau's like, they're all racists and Nazis and stealing food from the homeless. It's incredible. By the way, Trudeau has still refused to meet with any of these folks. So he's going down and kneeling on the ground about Canadian racism, but he's refusing to meet with people who are saying, let us keep our livelihoods if we don't want to vax because we, for example, already have natural immunity. Or, by the way, if we don't want to vax because we are driving alone in the cab of our car for thousands of miles. According to the Daily Wire, new exclusive report, Canadian protesters are unbowed by any of this. David Paisley says he has been protesting for weeks now and, as a street captain, helps organize protesters and direct those who wish to support the cause with funds, goods, or services. Paisley told the Daily Wire Trudeau's announcement, which made headlines across major news organizations in the US and Canada, went off barely noticed by the protesters on the ground. He said no one really cares about the new announcement. I mean, the police have been breaking the law long before any emergency power. They were taking our fuel away. They were arresting people for purely having jerry cans or emptying tanks of fuel. They've already been doing these emergency powers. All it does is make people dig in their heels even more. The irony is that these very powers and threats are exactly why we are here. This, of course, is exactly right. And it's no surprise that this is coming from not Fidel Castro's son. I mean, not Fidel Castro's son has always had a certain warmth toward authoritarianism. Look on back to 2013 when he was openly praising the Chinese regime for their effectiveness in being able to swivel on policy.
Even with Sun TV watching for any slip, he was asked which country he most admired and referred to China.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fastest. We need to start, investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted that I find quite interesting.
So he's saying Stephen Harper was an authoritarian while he's praising China? Dude. Yeah, but that's true. I mean, for the left, authoritarian power, centralized authoritarian power is a good. Thomas Friedman used to praise the Chinese economic model because he said it was great. You could turn things on a dime. It was wonderful. The left always has these fantasies about having centralized power so they can do anything they could possibly want. There's an entire article in the CBC, from the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, titled, Why the Word Freedom is Such a Useful Rallying Cry for Protesters. Experts say the word has become common among far-right groups. According to the CBC, and I believe this is a government-funded entity, as demonstrations against COVID-19 restrictions continue across Canada, the word freedom is on the lips and placards of many protesters. Often associated with protests and rallies in the United States, the term has taken hold among protesters who are part of the Freedom Convoy. For many, freedom is a malleable term, one that's open to interpretation. That flexibility, in part, has fueled its growth among certain groups, says Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at the Oshawa-based Ontario Tech University. It's a term that has resonated. You can define it and understand it and sort of manipulate it in a way that makes sense to you and is useful to you depending on your perspective. She trolled cross-country checkup. It's also a term that has thrived among far-right groups, said Perry, one of a number of experts who say the presence of far-right groups in Canada is growing. If you use the word freedom, it means they're probably a terrorist. She said, I think it resonates very much with what we're seeing and maybe take some inspiration from what we've been seeing in the United States over the last year and a half, leading up to the last election and the events of January 6th. Yes, freedom itself is bad now. Evan Balgord, executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, says, quote, when they're yelling they care so much about their freedom, they're taking freedoms away from other people who don't have the same kind of agency and choice that they do. See, you have to shut down their freedom so that they won't act freely. And then people who have pre-existing conditions can't walk around without a mask. Why are they walking around without a mask anyway? Since that's not effective. This is the key. Elizabeth Ankar says to see the word freedom bandied about as part of these protests points to a broader circulation of what Elizabeth Ankar called violent forms of freedom. Freedom is a slippery concept, says Ankar, an associate professor of political science at George Washington University. On the far right, individual freedom is often translated into somebody who refuses to be bound by norms of equality, treating all people equally, or norms to remedy inequality, while that's trying to remedy racial discrimination or gender discrimination. So in other words, freedom can be used to fight equality. And we need to make you do what we want you to do. Freedom's bad. So if you say freedom, this means that you're a far-right extremist crazy person because you haven't bought into the communitarian identity politics that we promote. Okay, this is what it comes down to. Ankar says the concept of freedom as displayed in the anti-mandate protests is something more often attributable to the United States. Freedom is often used almost as a national entitlement, as a claim for what people have, she said. While some in the United States may see mask mandates as a violation of individual rights, for example, citizens in many other countries wouldn't consider such rules to be an intrusion. In those places, it's likely there's a general consensus that wearing masks is for the benefit of society's most vulnerable. Yes, but it is a violation of freedom. But this is the new left-wing talking point. Paul Krugman over at the New York Times, maybe it's not a new left-wing talking point. Maybe it's just the left-wing talking point. Paul Krugman at the New York Times has an entire article today titled, When Freedom Means the Right to Destroy. When freedom means the right to destroy. It's amazing. So they're evil and they are destructive, as opposed to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was good because obviously when they were burning down stores, what they were fighting for was equality, not freedom. Says Paul Krugman, the BLM demonstrations were a reaction to police killings of innocent people. What's going on in Canada is on its face about rejecting public health measures intended to save lives. Of course, even that is mainly an excuse. What it's really about is an attempt to exploit pandemic weariness to boost the usual culture war agenda. These people, they really despise individual freedom. They really do. And here's the thing. In Canada, they've been loosening restrictions in a wide variety of places. Why? Because we're done, okay? Omicron has been on the downslope everywhere. Everyone knows this. This is why European countries have been getting Norway, Denmark, Sweden. They're getting rid of all their restrictions. And in Canada, they're tightening up just because Justin Trudeau has a pole up his ass. It's incredible. And now they're invoking emergency powers. Okay, so in Ontario, for example, okay, this is happening in Ottawa. As of March 1, according to the New York Times, the province of Ontario will no longer require people to show proof of vaccination to enter any indoor spaces, says the Premier Doug Ford. In a call with reporters, Mr. Ford said the change in public policy to rescind the so-called vaccine pass was based on the diminishing number of coronavirus cases and hospitalizations, and was not a concession to the demonstrators. See, it's very important to point out that it's not about the demonstrators. It's that we have been following the science all along. It just so happens that it coincides exactly with the protests. Ford said, let me be very clear. We're moving in this direction because it's safe to do so. Today's announcement is not because of what's happening in Ottawa or Windsor, but despite it. Starting February 17th, indoor capacity limits in the province will be loosened, outdoor gathering limits lifted entirely. He said mask mandates will remain in place a little while longer. He said he made that decision in consultation with his Minister of Health. Hey, by the way, it's not just Ontario. In Alberta, okay, this is last week, Alberta announced that it will lift a number of COVID-19 restrictions, including ending its Vax Passport program among residents. So just to get this straight, in Ontario, right now, where the protesters are, there is no longer a vax mandate to enter indoor spaces, but there's still a vax mandate if you want to be alone in the cab of your truck driving. In Alberta, they've relieved a bunch of their vax mandates. Their Vax Passport program is now done. Starting Wednesday, capacity limits of under 500 for venues, libraries, and places of worship will end, according to the Edmonton Journal. On Monday, Alberta said it would end its mask mandate for school kids and kids under the age of 12 in a particular setting. So that's in Alberta. In Saskatchewan, the proof of vaccine mandate is over. According to the CBC, as Saskatchewan lifts its proof of vaccination or negative test requirements to enter businesses, Premier Scott Moe says now is the right time to begin to end restrictions. As of Monday, people will no longer need to provide vax proof to enter many facilities, including restaurants, liquor stores, or theaters. But federally, they're now invoking the Emergencies Act to continue to try to cram down a federal rule that truckers have to vaccinate or be fired. Okay, so Quebec, same thing. Quebec Premier François Legault had one message for Quebecers Tuesday. It is time to learn to live with the virus. Quote, the population is fed up. I'm fed up. We're all fed up. The reason we resisted easing restrictions until today was because there was too much risk. Right now, we can take a calculated risk and finally turn the page. So, a huge number of the provinces of Canada have now been relieving these restrictions. And yet Justin Trudeau is doubling down. And the reason that Justin Trudeau is doubling down is because the left must maintain control, and they must maintain the lie that everything they've done so far was a good idea. That's the thing. In order to double down on their own idiotic policies, they've determined that it is necessary to now invoke an Emergencies Act that allows them to completely violate the financial freedom of their own citizens, the freedom of protest of their own citizens. I mean, it's truly incredible. The death of individual freedom in our neighbor to the north over nothing, over truly nothing. This is one of the most vaxxed countries on planet Earth. These truckers aren't a danger to anyone else. Truckers in the cab of their truck driving thousands of miles, the people who are allowing the supply chains to run, people who are disproportionately middle or lower class driving these trucks, and see a lot of billionaires driving those trucks. These are the people that you have to crack down on if you're Justin Trudeau. The party of the people. But this is the key. For the elites, it was never about the people. For the elites, it was always about the idea of control. And if they could control you at the beginning by praising essential workers, they would do so. Right? The essential workers have to, but you're not an essential worker. You're not. You're a small business person. And what does it matter if you lost your life savings? What does it matter if your dream is dead now? None of that matters. Not one whit. But then the essential workers are the problem because they're not getting vaxxed the way I want them to. So now the essential workers have to be punished. By the way, it's happening in the United States as well. New York just fired something like 1,400 workers over the vax mandate, completely unnecessarily. According to the New York Times, New York City has fired 1,430 city workers for failing to comply with its vax mandate, a figure that represents less than 1% of the city's workforce, but likely the nation's largest mass termination of municipal employees in response to a COVID vaccine mandate. So New York is doing this. In Los Angeles, students are still being banned from class if they've not actually taken the vax. Okay, like all of this is completely unnecessary. And yet they continue to do it. They continue to do it. And the only reason to continue to do it, when they're telling you the science changed, by the way, which is why they're relieving all the restrictions, even after they say that, they must continue to do this because the opponent really is freedom. Not the quote unquote faux freedom that they suggest it is. The opponent really is the idea that people have individual rights, and those individual rights come before the collective ability of the government to quash those individual rights. It's scary stuff. It really is, and it should scare you if you're in the West. Because if it can happen in Canada, why can't it happen in the United States? If it can happen in Australia, why can't it happen in the United States? I mean, it has happened in a bunch of different states in the United States. And if they had federal power to do this, they would do it. No, I mean, Joe Biden tried to do it, right? Joe Biden tried to do it with the vax mandate crammed down on private businesses, which would have forced some 85 million people to vax or be fired. He tried to do this. It's just because we have a court system that still upholds constitutional rights. This is why the constitutional system is such a necessity. But it's truly frightening. And I think maybe the most frightening thing, after all, is that as soon as you say emergency, so many millions, hundreds of millions of people are willing to grant centralized power to anyone who claims emergency. And the left is not shy about this. That's going to be the battle in the future. The battle for the future is going to be whether you have a citizenry that is self-confident enough to say that we deserve to make our own decisions, or whether elites perched at the top of our institutions get to make those decisions for us so long as they claim that they are helping us in the process. So long as they claim they are saving us, we will give them ultimate power. And COVID should have been the moment that everybody woke up to what a lie that was. Because we did. We gave them ultimate power. We allowed them to spend $7 trillion. We allowed them to shut down every business in the United States, except for the giant businesses that helped out many of their political friends. We allowed them to mask children uselessly for 2 years. We allowed them to do all these things. And you know what happened? Almost 1 million Americans died. This is what happened. So that should be case one in the lexicon of failures of government. The one area where the government was supposed to save you, they couldn't. And we did give them ultimate power. And many of us were willing to go along with that at the beginning. This was not all about resistance. The truth is that large-scale sort of resistance to the left's preferred policies really only cropped up maybe 3-4 months into the pandemic and didn't come into full flower until well after the vaccines were available. Levels of masking in the United States mirrored the prevalence of the virus everywhere, including in the South, throughout the pandemic. So this should have been a wake-up moment for members of the West. For people who still believe, supposedly, in liberty and freedom, this should have been a wake-up moment. That the government can't do all the things it promises you. That the government lies to you. And instead, the people who are invested in that lie, that they can solve all your problems if you keep giving them power, to prove it, they're going to centralize even more power to themselves. They're going to aggregate even more powers to themselves. They're going to declare emergency after emergency from here on in. This is the direction the West is moving. That's why the Freedom Convoy is important. And that's why its message needs to spread. Because if it doesn't, then the collectivists will win. And the way they define freedom is as you don't have any. They have the freedom to tell you what to do. You don't have the freedom to say that you are an individual with different priorities. Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?